Hello everyone. Today we're here to talk about conclusions, completing the EPQ report. It should be a joyous time because it's the end of the hard essay, but for many of us the conclusion is a very difficult thing to write, not least because we're trying to put together the end of a long argument to make sure that it's not too long, but that it contains the necessary information so that your reader actually understands what it is that you've argued in your report. Now that may not sound too difficult, but I think most students, and I speak for myself as well, find the conclusion the most difficult thing to write. We want to end on an interesting note. We want the reader to have enjoyed our report, and we want to feel as though there are significances to our report, that it was worth reading. So I've made the screencast and I've tried to be very careful in it to show that writing a conclusion is really an art form. It is the last thing that somebody reads, and it's often what they remember most vividly. So what will we cover today? We're going to be looking at the EPQ assessment criteria and how the conclusion is absolutely vital in order to score high marks. We're going to look at the idea of the take-home message in the conclusion. We're going to look at the importance of line of argumentation, of making sure that your introduction and your conclusion read well together. And of course that your main body of your essay has done what you say that you've done in your conclusion. We're going to look at some of the don'ts when writing a conclusion. We're going to look at the ingredients of an effective conclusion. We're going to look at the value of hedging in academic writing. This is something that would be important throughout the essay, but particularly important in the conclusion. We're going to be looking at the differences between what I call hard and soft conclusions. And finally, we're going to look at some examples of desk students' conclusions, which I'm going to pick apart in order to give you good exemplar material. Now, beginning with the definition. Conclusion, this is a very simple definition taken from an online dictionary, is the end or finish of an event, a process or a text, and a judgment. Now I chose that because I think that that is what a good conclusion is, really. It ends something, but it also provides a judgment. It reaches a conclusion. It shows us the purpose of the report. And so in that sense, it's absolutely vital. And when we're looking at the assessment criteria for the EPQ, AO1, which is the idea of managing the project. A lot of students think that this is just to do with drawing Gantt charts and timelines and showing that you were effective in terms of planning. But AO1 also takes into account the conclusion, because the conclusion will sum up how successful you've been in your report. What was it that you actually discovered? So in terms of scoring AO1 marks, a well-written conclusion is absolutely vital if you're going to get the kind of 8, 9 or 10 score in AO1. In AO3, the conclusion is also important, the idea of the develop and realize, because you can communicate in your conclusion some of the difficulties, limitations in your report that you faced. And let's be honest, when you are a sixth form student, you're not really able to conduct a very large scale piece of research. So some element of self-criticism is quite useful in terms of the conclusion. And in terms of your review and your ability to self-evaluate, well, that can also come into the conclusion. So I began this screencast by talking about the assessment criteria because it's so vital when we're writing anything, planning anything, that we have to think all along, how am I being judged? What am I being judged against? And although I've restricted that particular lesson to this screencast, that's something that we should have throughout the EPQ. We should say to ourselves, here is the mark scheme. How can I earn marks? How can I help my supervisor and the center coordinator show the exam board that I am using these required skills? Now, perhaps the most important thing of both the presentation and the conclusion is the idea of what we could call a take-home message, all right? Just like a takeaway, something that the audience is going to depart with. So in order to do a good or deliver a good take-home message, you do need a clear focus. And that's something that, as I say, is also very important in the presentation. This is something that your audience will remember and take away with them. Don't leave the marker wondering what the point of the report was. It's important to avoid ambiguity. You can be complex, but you have to make it clear what it was that this essay was about. Now, one of the key things, and this is something that the textbook exercise encourages you to do, is always write down the point of the essay in plain English. That's for your own benefit, so that you know exactly what the purpose of your writing was. Now, it sounds simple, but it's absolutely a key thing. Many people end a report and they don't really know why they wrote it. Now, it's absolutely key that you avoid this situation. And once again, I'm going to refer to the value of planning, thinking ahead, and making sure that you know what the destination of your essay report is going to be. Now, I also use the term resonance, and I'm using the proper graphic here of the waves that go outwards. You want to make a convincing point in your take-home message. You want to, as I say, be clear, but you want something that resonates with your readers, that has a sense of impact and importance. And I'm going to be showing you how to do that. Now, here's a quick little concluding statement that I've taken from the textbook. The title here was, "Do the benefits of hydraulic fracturing supersedes the environmental threat it poses?" And the simple, blunt take-home message are, there are arguments for and against fracking, and an honest debate is needed to address these arguments. It's very clear. We know exactly what the essay has come to the conclusion of. However, it's dull. It lacks a sense of grandeur. It lacks resonance. So here's a rewriting of it. Opponents of fracking argue that extraction causes environmental destruction. Supporters see it as a global revolution we cannot afford to ignore. We either need to re-engineer our society to require less energy, or we look for new sources of energy. An honest debate on this issue is required. Well, it's much more dramatic. It restates the argument. It's written in far more persuasive and descriptive terms, isn't it? It actually has resonance. Now, that is a genuine piece of a conclusion taken from a student's work. So that is something that we'll be looking at. Now, in addition to establishing resonance to this idea, as we see here, of showing the outer ripples, the importance of your report, another absolutely key thing is to consider that you have a very clear line of argument. And you can do this, obviously, by very careful planning, where the introduction opens up the debate and signposts the direction of the report, the main body of the essay, which is the meat of the report, the substance of the report, and the conclusion that tells the reader what it is that we should believe based on the evidence and an evaluation of the quality of the debate on both sides. So how do we establish this clear line of argument? Well, one of the things that I would like you to do always is to, once you've finished your conclusion, is to go back to your introduction and read the introduction and the conclusion following one another. And what you should find is that there's a clear sense of direction. The introduction opening up the debate and the conclusion closing the debate. In between, of course, you need all of the substance and the evidence. Now, some of the don'ts in a conclusion that are very important is do not end with a lengthy quotation. In a moment, we'll look at an excellent EPQ conclusion, which makes this small mistake. In general, we can have a short conclusion, if you quotation in a conclusion, if you feel that it is vital, that it's a particularly pithy quotation. But most of the time, we would avoid quotations in a conclusion. We don't want you simply to sum up. Lots of people think you just say in summary or in conclusion, we have seen this, we've seen that. I'm just going to give you a very dull paraphrase of my entire essay. That's a big mistake. We have to have some sense of selection and judgment in the conclusion. And of course, do not focus on a minor point. The conclusion should be the salient, the prominent points, the most important aspect of your argument. Also avoid stating your thesis, your actual argument for the first time in a conclusion. Some students actually do this. They don't present the thesis in their introduction. They don't make the thesis really clear in the main body of their essay, and they simply produce it in their conclusion. It's too late there. Do not introduce lots of new material in your conclusion. It's a time to look at the important aspects that have already been said. You can widen the debate, and I'll go into that in a moment, but no new material on the whole. Avoid ending with a rephrased thesis statement without any substantive changes. So again, don't just repeat what was in the introduction. Don't simply make emotional appeals in the conclusion as well. If you've written a very scientific, thoughtful, and analytical paper, please don't all of a sudden make a huge emotional appeal for social change, etc. It will seem strange. And don't include lots of technical details. So things like statistics, quotations, and findings. That really is for the main body of the report and should be avoided. The conclusion, I won't call it a simplification, but it is definitely a slimming down of the complexity. As we said previously, it is the take-home message, and therefore, on the whole, you'll avoid a lot of technical details and complexity. One thing that you can do in a conclusion, particularly a conclusion when it relates to something like a history essay or an ethics essay, is you can show the bigger picture. You can move from what I say here, from the local to the global. So if your essay, for instance, concerned the identity of students in an international school and how important it is that we're all included, you can make a more general point about how important it is in multicultural society that everyone is recognized. So you can make this movement from the local to the global. And that helps to give your report significance and resonance, the term that we used earlier. Now, the structure of the conclusion. This is a generic structure which you might find useful. And the key word there is the modal might, because there should be no formula for writing conclusions. Contrary to what some websites will tell you, it partly depends on your subject matter. It partly depends on the nature of your conclusion. So whenever I present a generic structure, I always want to kind of present it with a warning. You can use it, but you don't have to. Essay writing, and in particular EPQ report writing, should not be by numbers. There should be an element of creativity and flexibility in the report. So you might like to include a brief recap of what you've covered, brief being the key. This is absolutely key. Highlight the most important aspects of your report. That's absolutely really key. There should and must be an evaluative judgment aspect in the conclusion. You may wish to, again, identify areas that require further research, and we'll see this in a moment, an example of one of these. And of course, very importantly, you have to have your take-home message, as we said. But as I said, if you could rephrase that so that it has some kind of resonance, some kind of significance, that would be the ideal. Now, conclusion words. I won't spend too long on this slide because you can review it another time. There are obviously a number of phrases that are absolutely vital, a number of lexical units which you'd expect. And they're things like by and large, ordinarily. I would avoid saying in conclusion too much, of course, because that becomes very generic, okay? We use terms like on balance, etc. So they can be very useful, and you can find further lists of these words on the web. Now I'm going to distinguish between what I call a hard conclusion and a soft conclusion. And I'm beginning by showing you what a hard conclusion is. Okay. So you've looked carefully at the debate and you have found a clear winner. So you've looked at position X and you've decided that that is clearly correct and position Y is wrong. Now there's no harm with this. Some people do come to this conclusion. I think it's quite rare because usually debates are more complex than clear winners and clear losers, and you should be worried when your conclusions are simply black and white. But you may wish to, in your essay, conclude with a clear winner, in this case, X. The evidence is overwhelming for X, you've decided. I call that the hard conclusion with a clear winner. Now, there are two different soft conclusions I'm going to cover. One is that you begin with this idea that there's some merit in both cases. So both X and Y have things about their positions which are correct. The conclusion you might come to is perhaps the answer lies somewhere in the middle. Now, this is a very popular position for students to take, and in fact it's probably quite a sensible one because usually different schools of thought may have insights and they can't see the value of each other's positions because they're so doctrinaire that they've decided that they have to be right. So your position is a kind of compromise position, a midpoint position, where you say, well, there's virtue in X and there's virtue in Y. Some kind of amalgamation of these 2 points might take us closer to the truth. So I'm calling that soft conclusion number 1. What's soft conclusion number 2? Again, there is some merit in both cases. However, X has more merit than Y. I've tried to illustrate that with the length of the line here, you see. So you could say, whilst Y has some merit to its position, X is more compelling. You might want to use that phrase then, on balance, X seems to be a stronger position than Y. And then you can use the hedging where you say there are certain elements of Y which have value, but X is the stronger position. That is the conclusion point that I think many of you want to take. It seems to show an element of compromise, but not simply be sitting on the fence and in the middle. I feel that in many cases that's a braver conclusion to take. So the hard conclusion, soft conclusion 1, where you go for the midpoint, and soft conclusion 2, where you decide that one of them is stronger than the other, although there is an element of merit in both cases. Now, hedging. What is hedging? In academic writing, as I say here, it's prudent to be cautious in one's claims. We don't make assertive claims where we make grand claims without really knowing or proving or having evidence, okay? And part of being prudent is known as hedging. It's the use of linguistic devices to express hesitation or uncertainty. In terms of social life, it demonstrates politeness quite often, okay? And as you can see here are a whole load of hedging words like certainly, probability, it seems, it appears, it suggests, conceivably is a nice one to use, okay? It is widely agreed that, etc. So hedging language is usually used in academia because it shows that you're not just rushing to conclusions, that you have the maturity, the intellectual maturity to defer your opinions and be careful in your conclusions. It's something that I strongly recommend that you use throughout the report, and it's particularly important in the conclusion. So rather than making huge claims, I would almost always avoid the word prove. I have proven that, etc. That's a huge claim, and I think that it's best to avoid that term. So how do we hedge? Okay, we use introductory verbs like seem, tend, look like, appear to be. We use lexical verbs like believe, assume, and suggest. We use modality, possibly, perhaps, conceivably. That clauses. It could be the case that. It might be suggested that. There is every hope that. Now here's a couple of examples. It may be said that the commitment to some of the social and economic concepts was less strong than it is now. May be said, suggesting there is a possible way of seeing the world another way. The lives they chose may seem overly ascetic and self-denying. Again, acknowledging that not everyone's going to agree with you. May seem. So that's hedging. Now let's have a look at a conclusion that comes from the textbook, the official AQA EPQ textbook. And I want you to think about the take-home message here. This student has written about medical marijuana, and he says, whether medical marijuana should be accorded the status of a legitimate pharmaceutical agent has long been a contentious issue. In effect, the decision whether to legalize the medical use of marijuana should be based on a dispassionate scientific analysis. Indeed, a number of such investigations have recently been published in peer-reviewed literature. Data from these studies suggests that medical marijuana has demonstrated safety and efficacy in treating several devastating human pathologies. Some individuals, as a result, may believe that this documentation now warrants marijuana's approval for use as a legitimate therapeutic agent. Others may think the additional scientific scrutiny is necessary. So notice how the main points of the debate are rehearsed here, and they're rehearsed, as I say, with resonance. So should marijuana be approved as a bona fide medication? In conclusion, this essay was not intended to provide an answer. Instead, it is strongly argued in favor of the concept that scientific data and methodology, rather than political and ideological considerations, ultimately should lead to a rational decision. Whether the data derived from current and future scientific investigations will justify the approval or disapproval of medical marijuana remains a challenging issue for the future. So here's a brief assignment for you. I would like you to look for the following things in this conclusion. A brief recap, highlighting the most important aspects, evaluating the main arguments, identifying if there are areas that require further research, and what the take-home message is. I'm now going to pause the video, and I'm going to ask you to do the same so that you actually look at this and you think about this particular essay for 5 minutes. Now, I hope you found that a useful exercise. I'm not going to go through the answers because I think the value of that exercise will be the process of you learning. That's a very well written, again, genuine conclusion from an EPQ report, written in beautiful English. It feels extremely academic. It's written in academic register, and it has some nice dramatic moments to it. It has many of the hallmarks of an excellent conclusion, and notice that it is succinct, to the point, highly focused, and memorable, of course. Now I'm going to look at some examples from students in DESC who've written EPQs, and I'm going to focus on the conclusion. The first one I'm going to have a look at is a report that addressed this question. To what extent was the Soviet-Afghan war responsible for the rise of violent Islamicism? Okay. Now, again, I'm going to ask you to have a close look at this conclusion. I'm going to read part of it to you, but what I think the best thing, rather than reading is a chunk, is I would like to break it into different parts for you to see how it's made up. But firstly, could I ask you to read it? You've had time to read this conclusion. I think you'll agree that it's an excellent conclusion in the main. It's from a top EPQ report. Let's start to analyze it by taking it apart. So I'm going to look at this first section now. In conclusion, the above analysis makes it clear that there are a number of factors responsible for the rise of Islamicism, many of which haven't been touched upon in this essay due to there being so many. R. Waltering argues that Islamicism didn't exist in the first 14th century of Islamic history, thus should be seen as a modern phenomenon which started again in the 1970s and 80s. This gives weight to the main argument explored, that the Soviet-Afghan war is responsible for the rise of violent Islamicism. It is apparent that this war is responsible because of the influences from the Middle East, with prominent figures like Abdullah Azzam, Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, paired with funding from many Middle Eastern countries. Now, this is a very interesting opening. You'll notice that she restates what the essay has been about. I particularly like the fact that she says that she hasn't been able to cover everything. One of the things that we like to do in conclusions is to admit gaps in our research, gaps in our knowledge, because being humble is a good thing in academia. And identifying areas that require further research is excellent. Here she goes back to Waldringham's work. You might argue that it's introducing unnecessary complexity, but he is one of the most important theorists in her essay. She talks about the main argument being explored, that the Soviet-Afghan war is responsible for the rise of violent Islamicism. And she repeats some of the main characters there. So I think that that's a very interesting and focused section. Now moving down. In addition to this, the USA had influence through finance, weapons, and training as they were desperate for the Soviet Union to lose. Furthermore, the political instability that was hugely prevalent after the war led to the formation of the Taliban and the utter destruction of Afghanistan's political system. These factors are undoubtedly responsible for violent Islamicism. So I think this section here you can see is the recap. It looks at some of the prominent aspects of her report and it kind of packages them for the reader so that they can remember the complexity of the debate in this essay. Moving on. However, it is important to note that contrary to Waldringham's argument, there may have been forms of violent Islamicism that predate the Soviet-Afghan war, such as Wahhabism. This lessens the extent to which the war is responsible for Islamicism. Yet it is interesting to note that Wahhabism increased in popularity after the Soviet-Afghan war. This produces the argument that the war was not responsible in itself for radical ideologies or interpretations of Islam, but that it provided a platform for these ideologies to fester or thrive. Now I'd like you to again stop this video and have a very clear think about the argumentation here. Now that you've had time to look at that, you will see that the argument is multi-layered. It shows Waldringham's argument, it then attacks Waldringham's argument and shows that there is more complexity. Reports that are not black and white in their conclusions are usually the best reports because they acknowledge the complexity of the debate. Now moving on to the final section. The crux of the argument is that violent Islamicism became more appealing and accessible through the Soviet-Afghan war to Afghans because of their desperation and hope that they placed in Islam and to Muslims around the world because they saw it as their duty to help their Muslim brothers and sisters. Andrew Hayward argued that a link can be made between the 9/11 attacks and the Soviet war because of the extremism and radical groups that it inspired. Therefore, to a great extent, the Soviet-Afghan war was responsible for the rise of violent Islamicism. So you can see that in the end there's a definite conclusion. It's a very nuanced, hedged, and intelligent position to take, but it leaves us with a very clear take-home message. That is one example of a conclusion. And obviously this is within the discipline of history, politics, international relations. I'm now going to move on to have a look at a scientific conclusion. And this report addressed the following question. To what extent will personalized medicine revolutionize the healthcare industry in the prevention and treatment of malignant melanoma? So it's looking at two different things. First of all, it's looking at this terrible disease here, malignant melanoma, which is a kind of skin cancer, as many of you will know. But the most important element of it is, how will this personalized medicine work? That's medicine that is orientated towards individual patients rather than just general cures. It will look at the patient as an individual. First thing I want you to see is how the contents page worked. It just shows how orderly this is. And I include this here because an orderly essay will almost always lead to an orderly conclusion. Begins with an abstract, and my next screencast will be how to write an abstract that sum up your whole essay and the reason for it. There's an introduction, a definition of personalized medicine, a definition of myeloma, genetic mutations associated with myeloma, prevention of melanoma using personalized medicine, personalized treatments for melanoma, and the integration into the National Health Service before the conclusion. So I want to remind you how important it is that you think very clearly about the bits of your essay and how they fit together. And here is the introduction. It's across 2 slides, as you can see. It is 2 paragraphs, but I think it's a very interesting example, and it's written in a highly condensed, highly succinct manner. Finally, the main takeaway point of this discussion to be understood is that a choice has to be made as to whether money, time, and effort needed to investigate and develop techniques and resources to support this new approach to the healthcare system is worth it to treat diseases such as melanoma. Many factors have been considered, including the weighing up of the possible benefits to patients and society of this being a success against all the possible costs, financial and other. One deciding factor for this could be that there is no point in diagnosing and mapping genomes to identify mutations that cannot be treated. Also, the presence of a mutation associated with cancer, for example, the BRAF mutation, does not guarantee the development of cancer such as melanoma. It only increases the risk. So by making patients aware of their risks, will value be added to the healthcare system, or will it help to create a society of paranoid hypochondria? What is so effective about this aspect of the conclusion is it restates and shows why the argument is so important. This report is looking at a vital aspect that could either help people's health or not. And the conclusion reminds us of how important and how complex this debate is. Now I'm going to move on to the next section of the conclusion. In the case of melanoma, multiple mutations that are associated with this high risk have been identified as mentioned throughout this report. You'll notice here the linking to the main body, and treatments specific to them have been and are being developed. This means melanoma treatment is currently actionable, which suggests that it is worth exploring the approach of personalized medicine further for melanoma specifically. However, without the research conducted, these treatment drugs would not exist, so there would not be any personalized interventions available. This makes a case for research for other diseases too, as there is so much potential in this field, and these issues can only become actionable and therefore worthwhile if there is more research conducted. So there's a very clear conclusion here. We know what the report is. It acknowledges that it's a complex and difficult area, but we come away with a very clear take-home message. And I think that that's another very fine example. I'm going to do one more now. In this particular essay here, my final title, an agreed form of product. I want to remind you that in the midterm review, that is where you will put your final title down. So don't forget that. Yeah, it's very important that you do that. And once you lock in your final title, that's something that can't be changed. So it's something worth remembering, isn't it? Okay. And this particular title is, can the use of nanotechnology and renewable energy solve our energy crisis? So quite a difficult title. Here is the conclusion. The energy crisis is one in which covers a multitude of fields and countries. However, the use of nanotechnology and renewable energy does the same. Crucial steps have been taken towards solving the energy crisis in regard to using nanotechnology. However, that is not enough. Using nanotechnology and renewable energy is not enough to solve the energy crisis, especially not with the current available technology, as it is not advanced enough to meet the energy demands or mass-produced or mass distributed. This is partly due to society's hindrance, therefore it is society's task to fix the issue. The potential of nanotechnology has been established, but it will take time to advance. Hence, other technologies should be used in the interim phase, such as biofuels, windmills, hydroelectric stations, so on and so forth. So this is a very clear conclusion. It's powerfully written. You can feel that there is analysis here and reasons for the argument, but there's a real sense of passion as well, isn't there? And it offers this very interesting idea of an interim phase. So again, that this is a really nuanced and clever conclusion. In this bit here, I'm just going to read a little bit more here. To conclude, the use of nanotechnology can solve the energy crisis, however, only if we create an environment in which it can prosper. So, very carefully thought out, very clear take-home message, a real sense of resonance. We understand the importance in terms of the energy crisis that we feel and in terms of the kind of environmental crisis which we face. So again, an excellent conclusion, and you can stop this screencast and you can look at those more carefully. So we've seen one on history and politics, we've seen the one from the textbook on medical use of marijuana, we've seen this one on nanotechnology, we've seen the one on personalized medicine. Gives you a nice field of different disciplines of conclusions, and you'll see that they're all varied and different. And my take-home point is going to be this. Edgy Birdie can solve it all for you. It says all you need to do is to copy all of your paragraphs that you need to create a summary, and then you can paste the text into a special box. You can click on the button and it will generate a conclusion for you. So if you do this, you don't really need to watch the screencast at all. It will just be done for you magically by looking at word frequency, I guess. But if you do this, I can guarantee you that your conclusion will be absolute rubbish. And the reason why I'm including this slide is to remind you that there are no magic formulas for essay writing and for thought in general. So please do not use Edgy Birdie's online summarizer to write your conclusions. Show some imagination instead, like the students that I've looked at today have done. Now, very quickly, I'm going to include 4 different websites here which have some excellent advice on conclusions if you need a few more ideas. This one's from Warwick University, there's one from Oxford University, there's one from the Writing Centre, and there's one from Scribner as well, okay? All of them offer some excellent tips. I've tried to use most of the information from them, but you may find some of them useful. So in conclusion, the conclusion is extremely important in terms of the assessment criteria. You must have a take-home message. The reader must know why you wrote this report. You should check that your line of argument works very clearly. Think carefully about the hard and the soft conclusion, which one is going to be the one for you. And most of all, don't use Edgy Birdie. Instead, make your conclusion memorable, unique, and interesting. Think about the idea of resonance. Think about the possibility of going from local to global. Good luck with your conclusions. I hope you found this a useful screencast. Thank you for listening. Looking for from you.